My name is Harold Dunn. I'm 77 years old, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, in a small wooden house that faces the railway where trains still pass every morning. For over 40 years, I worked for Southern Railways as a dispatcher, coordinating train signals and communications between stations. My job was to listen to whistles, radio calls, and urgent messages traveling up and down the line. Folks used to say we were the social media of small towns back then because whether it was good news or bad, it passed through my hands first. I saw pieces of people's lives through signals and wires, and I learned early that a single message could change everything. Even now, nearly 20 years after I retired, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night hearing the echo of a distant train horn, that lonely sound reminding me of the rhythm I once lived by, where everything was precise, on time, and far easier to understand than people ever were. But today, I'm not here to talk about trains, schedules, or the life I once knew by heart. What I want to share with you is a different story, one I've carried in silence for 10 long years, a story that changed my life forever. It's a story about love, betrayal, and death, about trust broken to pieces, and a truth so painful it forced me to question everything I ever believed about family. Speaking these words isn't easy. Even after all these years, my chest still tightens when I remember. But I believe someone out there needs to hear this. Maybe someone standing at a crossroads of loyalty, or someone tempted to betray a heart that's always loved them. Here in the South, we say, every choice is a road with no return. And my story proves just that. If you're still listening to me now, thank you. It means this old heart isn't talking to the void. Maybe you'll find a piece of yourself somewhere in this story. Today, I'll take you back to 2015, when I was 66 years old, the year when everything I believed in, everything I loved, and everything I called family was turned upside down in a single moment. In 2015, I was 67 years old, 7 years into retirement. Life was peaceful then. My wife, Marilyn, and I had been together for more than 40 years. We lived in a small house on the outskirts of Charleston, where everyone knew one another, and the sound of passing trains was the town's natural alarm clock. We had 2 grown children, David, a mechanical engineer, living in Atlanta with his wife and their 2 little boys, and Rachel, a high school teacher in Raleigh, North Carolina. Both had long left the nest to build lives of their own, so the house held only the 3 of us, Marilyn, my wife, myself, and my father, Eli Dunn, who was 88 at the time. Everyone in the neighborhood knew my father. He had spent his whole life as a shipwright at the Charleston dockyard. His hands had shaped wooden boats that skimmed across the Cooper River for decades. Even near 90, he remained sharp, remembering every small detail, his eyes still bright like when I was a boy. My marriage was nothing extraordinary, but I was content. Marilyn was gentle, quiet, and worked part-time in the district school office. She said she liked staying busy, liked the feeling of earning her own money, even though I was already retired. I didn't object. I believed a woman should have her own life too. I spent most of my free time tending to a few rows of tomatoes behind the house, fixing an old radio in my workshop, or visiting the railway yard where I had once worked just to hear the familiar whistle again. Sometimes I went to the Retired Railway Workers Club, where old men like me laughed at memories that felt both close and far away. As for my father, he was not one to sit still. Every morning before the sun rose, he was already out in the garden pruning his datura plants, watering the mint and lavender he had planted back when my mother was still alive. He always said, "Working keeps the heart young, Harold. Stop working and you stop living." I admired him deeply, the man who taught me how to cut wood, how to work with my hands, and how to live honestly. He didn't preach, he simply showed. And I believed no one in my life could ever take his place. Every Sunday evening after dinner, the 3 of us would sit on the porch, listening to the distant sound of trains. I would make coffee, and Marilyn would sometimes share stories from the school about children she felt sorry for. My father would just smile, eyes half closed, and say, "You know, Harold, your life now is like a train running exactly on its track. Don't change its direction unless the wind truly shifts." I did not know that only a short time later my train would derail, and it would never return to its old tracks again. That quiet life of ours began to shift around the middle of 2015. My younger brother, Frank, who lived down in Beaufort, started having health problems. Frank was 2 years younger than me, a mechanic all his life, but after his wife passed, he lived alone, and his health went downhill fast. I began calling often, then driving down to help, taking him to appointments, cooking, staying a few days at a time. Those short visits turned into longer stays, a week, sometimes 2. I never worried much about home. Marilyn always told me, "Go on, Harold. I'll take good care of your father. You know how strong he is." And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? For decades she'd been the steady, devoted wife I trusted completely. But it was during those absences that something began to change. Quietly, like a slow leak in a roof you don't notice until the storm comes. My father, Eli, sharp-eyed as ever, was the first to sense it. One morning after I got back from Beaufort, he said quietly, while we were alone in the kitchen, "Marilyn's been acting different, Harold. She goes out a lot, never says where." I chuckled, brushing it off. "Probably errands, Dad. You know how women are." But his eyes hardened. "No, son, I've lived long enough to know when someone's hiding something." I laughed it away, the way men do when they'd rather not face what their gut already knows. Then I started noticing little things too, harmless at first. Marilyn began paying more attention to her looks. She wore new dresses, new perfume. When I asked, she smiled and said, "A woman my age can still want to feel pretty, can't she?" I smiled back and believed her. One afternoon I came home earlier than expected. Frank's doctor had rescheduled. I opened the door to find Marilyn stepping out of the shower, her hair damp, her robe loose on her shoulders, the faint scent of a perfume I didn't recognize filling the room. "You're home early," she said quickly. "Didn't you have work today?" I asked. "I wasn't feeling well, came home early," she replied. Nothing in her tone sounded suspicious, but on the table beside her were 2 coffee cups, one still warm. I nearly asked, but stopped myself. My mind whispered, "Probably Dad's cup." When I told my father later, he fell silent for a long moment before saying, "Harold, sometimes the storm gives warning long before it hits. You just don't hear the whistle yet." Early in 2016, the spring wind swept through Charleston, carrying the scent of salt from the Cooper River. But inside me, something colder lingered, something I couldn't yet name. Frank, my brother in Beaufort, had fallen ill again, so I packed a bag for another visit. Marilyn helped me, as always. She smiled and said, "Go on, Harold. I'll take good care of your father. He's as strong as ever." I kissed her forehead before leaving. Back then, I still believed nothing could shake the foundation of our home. The trip lasted longer than I'd planned. Frank ended up in the hospital, and I stayed nearly 2 weeks. Each night, I called home. Marilyn's voice was calm, steady. "Everything's fine, Harold. Your father's doing great. He's been eating well." But later that week, when I asked to speak to Dad, she'd say, "He turned in early tonight," or "He went for a walk to the square." That was strange. My father never went to bed early. He liked to watch the late news, sipping coffee till nearly midnight. Finally, one evening, I managed to speak to him. His voice was weak, lower than usual. "You doing all right, Dad?" "I'm fine, son. When are you coming home?" "In about 3 days." There was a long pause. Then he whispered, "Come home sooner, Harold. There's something you need to know." That sentence haunted me all night. 3 days later, I left Beaufort at dawn. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I reached Charleston, the sunlight fading gold through the oaks. When I reached the house, I noticed something odd. The front door was unlocked. Marilyn was always careful about that. I stepped inside quietly, planning to surprise them. The house was silent except for the ticking clock and a faint trace of perfume in the air. "Marilyn? Dad?" I called. No answer. I checked my father's room. Empty. Bed perfectly made. It looked untouched. Then I heard it. A soft laugh from down the hall. A whisper. A murmur. The sound came from our bedroom. My heart started pounding as I walked closer. The door was slightly ajar. Through the narrow crack, I saw what no man should ever have to see. Marilyn, my wife of over 40 years, lay in the arms of Richard Hale, the town pharmacist, my old friend. I froze. Every sound in the world disappeared. I wanted to yell, to break down the door, but my body refused to move. I heard Marilyn giggle softly. "He's not coming home till tomorrow. We've got the whole afternoon." Then suddenly a hand rested on my shoulder. I turned. It was my father. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, then led me outside to the porch. His eyes were red, his voice trembling. "I've seen it happen more than once, Harold. Didn't want to tell you without proof. Now you've seen it yourself." I collapsed into the old porch chair. My father sat beside me, laid a hand on my shoulder. "I don't know how long it's been going on. Months, maybe longer. When you're gone, he comes here. Sometimes she meets him elsewhere. I heard her mention Buddy John's farm once." The sunlight was fading, painting his face in gold and shadow. "And what do I do, Dad?" I asked. "Only you can decide, son, but don't act in anger. A man led by rage always ends up regretting it." We sat there in silence. Far off, a train whistle echoed, a sound I once loved, now cutting through me like glass. I drove to my old friend John's house across town. He didn't ask questions, just poured me a cup of strong coffee and said, "Stay as long as you need." I spent the night staring out his window, listening to rain hit the tin roof, thinking only one thing. 40 years, traded for one afternoon of betrayal. I left John's house the next morning. I had barely slept at all. The images of Marilyn and Richard kept looping in my head like a broken reel of film. I didn't know how I was supposed to face her, but I knew I had to go back. When I walked into the house, the smell of smoked beef filled the kitchen, my favorite dish. Marilyn was standing by the stove, wearing an apron, stirring a pot of sauce. When she saw me, she smiled, as if nothing had happened. "You're home early, Harold. I thought you were coming back tomorrow." I stood in the doorway, looking at her for a long time. I no longer saw the woman I once loved. All I saw was a stranger wearing a too calm smile. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "He went down to the square for a walk. You know him? Always likes to watch the cars go by." I sat down at the table, my voice deep. "Marilyn, I know everything. Yesterday I saw you with Richard, with my own eyes." The spoon in her hand stopped mid-air. The sauce kept boiling, bubbling harshly. There was a moment of silence. Then she turned away and spoke quietly, coldly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Stop lying. My father saw it too. He tried to warn me, but I didn't believe him. Now I do. Marilyn slammed the spoon down. The metal hit the pot with a sharp clang. That nosy old man should have just stayed out of my business. It felt like someone had slapped me. Not because she had admitted it, but because of the contempt in her voice. "He's my father, Marilyn. He loved you like his own daughter." Loved? He was always watching, always interfering in our marriage. I'm tired of him. Anger surged through me, but my father's words echoed in my head. "Don't act in anger." "How long, Marilyn?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady. "Since the day you decided to devote your life to Beaufort and your brother," she said, turning her back. "And that justifies betrayal?" I asked. She let out a faint, bitter laugh. You abandoned me. I was lonely. Richard made me feel desired again. I did what I needed to feel alive. I felt myself go numb. The woman in front of me was no longer the wife I once knew. Just then, the front door opened. My father stepped inside. He looked at the two of us and asked quietly, "Everything all right, Harold?" Before I could answer, Marilyn spun around and pointed at him. "All right? Nothing's all right, and it's all his fault. If he hadn't been spying on me, none of this would have happened." My father took a step back. His face seemed to fold in on itself, shrinking, aging right there in the doorway. I shouted, "That's enough, Marilyn. You don't talk to my father like that." But she kept going. "He ruined my marriage. If he had any decency, he would have stayed silent." Her words hit the air like a slap. For a moment, everything froze, even the ticking clock. Then my father clutched his chest, his face drained of color, sweat beading across his forehead. "Dad!" I yelled, rushing to hold him. His breath came short, broken. "Harold, my heart?" I turned to Marilyn. "Call an ambulance, now." She stood frozen for a moment, then reluctantly reached for the phone. "They said it'll take at least 30 minutes to get here," she said flatly, as if it weren't my father's life slipping away in my arms. I held him on the floor, trying to support his head. His breathing grew weaker, his skin cold. "Stay with me, Dad, please." He gripped my hand, whispering, "Don't leave me. Alone? With her?" His words sent a chill through me. I looked at Marilyn, her eyes turned away, empty, stone cold. I screamed, "Marilyn, what did you do?" "What are you talking about? He's just having a heart attack." I don't remember how much I cried, only the distant sound of a train whistle, echoing like my own despair. The ambulance arrived more than 20 minutes later. We rushed him to the hospital. I sat outside the emergency room, my hands stained with his blood, the sharp smell of disinfectant stinging my nose. Marilyn sat far away, silent, her eyes dry. After an hour, the doctor came out, voice serious. "He suffered a severe myocardial infarction. We managed to stabilize him for now, but his condition is critical. He must remain under absolute rest." I nodded, tears blurring everything. They allowed me to see him for 5 minutes. I held his hand. His eyes were cloudy, but he still tried to speak. "Harold, be careful. I heard her on the phone. She said she wanted to get rid of me." I squeezed his hand, my voice breaking. "Don't talk anymore, Dad. Just rest." But he whispered one last time. "Be careful, Harold, with her." I could barely remember how that night passed. I sat on a cold plastic chair in the hospital hallway, my eyes fixed on the emergency room door. Marilyn sat across from me, her face expressionless, her eyes hollow. At dawn, the doctor came out, his expression heavy. I knew the answer before he spoke. We did everything we could, but his heart was too weak. Mr. Eli passed away at 6 a.m. I stood completely still. The world seemed to fall silent, leaving only the sound of the air conditioner and the frantic beat of my own heart. The man who taught me to live with honor, with work-worn hands and unwavering honesty, was gone. When I was allowed into the room, he lay there, strangely peaceful. I held his hand, the same hand that built boats and guided me through my childhood. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered. "I didn't protect you." As I stepped out, Marilyn finally approached. She dabbed at her eyes, her voice trembling, a performance I could recognize now. "He's gone?" "Yes," I answered without meeting her eyes. His heart gave out. "How tragic," she murmured, lowering her head. I looked straight at her, my voice low. "Or was it something else, Marilyn?" She looked up sharply, frowning. "What are you implying?" "My father heard you on the phone. He heard you say you wanted to get rid of him." She laughed, sharp, dismissive. "You must be insane. He was a confused old man. He misheard." I didn't respond. I simply watched her. For the first time, I saw not guilt in her eyes, but fear. The next day, I held my father's funeral. It was simple, yet many people came. Everyone respected Eli. Marilyn didn't attend. She claimed she was unwell, but I knew the truth. She couldn't face what she had done. My son David drove in from Atlanta, and Rachel flew from Raleigh. They were devastated. I didn't tell them everything, only that their grandfather had suffered a heart attack. But inside, I knew his death was far from natural. That evening, as we sat together on the porch, David asked, "Dad, what really happened?" I hesitated. Then I told them, every detail, every word spoken, every strange expression from Marilyn. When I reached the part about the phone call, Rachel burst into tears. How could Mom do that? I don't know, I said quietly, but I intend to find out. The next morning, while cleaning my father's room, I discovered a small notebook hidden under his mattress. The cover was worn, smudged with fingerprints, but the pages inside were neatly written in his shaky hand. As I read, a chill spread through me. He had recorded dates, times, and every instance Marilyn left the house, even snippets of conversations he overheard. Tuesday, 2 p.m. Richard visited, stayed nearly 2 hours, heard laughter from the bedroom. Friday, 10 a.m. Heard her on the phone saying, "The old man knows. I'm afraid he'll tell Harold." Saturday, heard her say over the phone, "If he dies, we'll finally be free." January 15th, she gave me a glass of vitamins and insisted I drink all of it. Stomach pain began afterward. I dropped the notebook, my hand trembling. Everything my father tried to warn me about was true. He had been trying to protect me, until the very end. David and Rachel read with me. My son clenched his fists. "Dad, this isn't suspicion anymore. We need to go to the police." Rachel whispered, "Did Mom poison Grandpa?" "It's possible," I said, barely above a whisper. "We'll let the law decide." That night, alone in my study, I heard the distant wail of the night train. A sound that once comforted me throughout my childhood now felt like a farewell. I placed my father's notebook on the desk beside an old photograph of the two of us. Under the soft yellow light, I made a silent vow. I will find the truth, Dad, even if I have to unearth every buried memory to do it. 2 days after the funeral, I went to the Charleston Police Department with David and Rachel, carrying my father's notebook in my hands. The more I read those pages, the more I knew. His death wasn't natural. We were met by Detective Paul Ramirez, a calm man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and a slow, thoughtful voice. He listened as I told him everything, from the affair to the argument to the warning my father whispered before he died. He didn't interrupt once. When I laid the notebook on his desk, he opened it, reading carefully, line by line. After a long silence, he said, "Mr. Dunn, what your father wrote here is enough to open an investigation." "So you believe this wasn't natural?" I asked. "I don't believe anything yet," he replied, "but I can smell when truth's been buried." He called in an officer to take photos of the notebook, log it as evidence, and asked if I still had my father's medication. I handed him the bottle of digoxin I'd kept. Ramirez sealed it in a clear evidence bag. "We'll have the lab test this. If something's off, I'll file for an exhumation order." The word exhumation sank into me like ice. The idea of digging up my father's grave felt unbearable, yet I knew it was the only path left toward truth. The thought of digging up my father's grave felt unbearable, but I knew it was the only way. "He deserves the truth," I said quietly. A few days later, Ramirez called. The lab found extremely high levels of digoxin, about 3 times the normal dosage. We're moving forward with the exhumation. When I told my children, Rachel began to cry, and David put a hand on my shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "whatever comes next, We face it together. A week later, on a cloudy morning, I watched as a small ambulance took my father's body from the cemetery, under the eyes of police and coroners. I stood at a distance, numb, hearing his voice echo in my head. Working keeps your heart from growing old. But mine, that day, felt broken beyond repair. The next 3 days were a blur. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my father's room, reading his notes over and over, looking for something, anything, I'd missed. Every word felt like his voice guiding me through the darkness. Then Ramirez called again. "We've got the results. Can you come down to the station?" When I arrived, his expression said everything. "Mr. Dunn," he began, "the autopsy found lethal levels of digoxin in your father's system. He was poisoned." I didn't speak. I couldn't. My world just stopped. "We cross-checked pharmacy records," he continued. "Hale Pharmacy, owned by Richard Hale, sold the same digoxin without a valid prescription. The buyer's name listed was Marilyn Dunn." I had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. "We're issuing warrants for both Marilyn Dunn and Richard Hale," Ramirez said gently. "They'll be taken into custody for questioning." The next morning, Charleston stood still. The news spread fast. The old dispatcher's wife and her lover accused of poisoning the father. Neighbors whispered. Some pitied me, some gossiped. I didn't care. My heart was empty. When the officers arrived at our house, Marilyn didn't resist. She just stood there, expressionless, as they read the charges. Then she turned to me and said softly, "You ruined my life, Harold." "No," I replied, voice barely above a whisper. "You did that yourself." As the patrol car rolled away, I didn't look back. I just stared at the horizon, where the morning train passed by, its whistle long and lonely, echoing through a town that suddenly felt too quiet. When the police took Marilyn and Richard Hale into custody, I thought I was ready for anything. But nothing could prepare me for the sight of the woman who had once been my whole world standing behind iron bars. The trial opened in July 2016. The Charleston papers called it the poisoning of Eli Dunn. Those words cut deeper than I could have imagined. They spoke of my father like a headline, not a man of honor who'd spent a lifetime building boats and raising his son right. The courtroom was packed. I sat in the front row with David and Rachel. When Marilyn entered, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, her hair gray, her eyes sharp, she glanced at me, not with shame, but with defiance. Richard Hale followed behind, head bowed. My old friend, the man who once toasted whiskey with me on my porch, now stood accused of killing my father. The prosecutor laid it out clearly. Victim, Eli Dunn, 89. Cause of death, lethal digoxin overdose. The drug was purchased illegally from Hale Pharmacy by the victim's daughter-in-law, Marilyn Dunn. Notes found in the victim's room, combined with the confession of Richard Hale, confirm a conspiracy to poison the victim. The room went silent. David's jaw clenched. Rachel's tears ran freely. Then Richard took the stand. His voice shook. "It started with Marilyn," he said. "She said the old man was suspicious. She said if he died, they could sell the house and start over somewhere new." "And you agreed?" asked the prosecutor. "At first, no," he muttered, "but she said she'd do it herself. Just a few extra doses," she said. "No one will ever know." I was a fool. Gasps echoed in the room. I turned toward Marilyn. She didn't cry. She just stared straight ahead, chin high. When it was her turn, she stood tall and cold. "I didn't kill anyone," she said firmly. "I only wanted to ease his pain. I didn't know the dosage was wrong. Richard handled the pills." The prosecutor read Richard's signed confession and the receipts showing her signature on the drug purchase. The defense tried to claim Marilyn was emotionally manipulated, but the jury didn't buy it. The trial dragged on for 3 long days. I listened as they dissected my family's life, every word, every lie, every betrayal, like evidence on a table. On the morning of sentencing, Charleston was draped in light rain. Judge Simmons, his hair silver and voice heavy, read the verdict. Richard Hale is found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Marilyn Dunn is found guilty of first-degree murder as the primary instigator. 20 years in prison, no parole for the first 10. The gavel struck. The sound echoed like thunder in my chest. Marilyn didn't move. For the first time, she looked at me. The fire in her eyes was gone. Only emptiness remained. As the guards led her away, she whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry." I didn't know if I believed her. I just sat there, numb as the door closed behind her. Outside the courthouse, the rain had turned to mist. Rachel leaned against my shoulder, crying. "Dad, how did it come to this?" "Sometimes justice hurts, sweetheart," I said quietly. "But at least your grandfather can finally rest." That evening, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on the porch. The wind carried the scent of wet magnolia leaves. The chair beside me, my father's chair, sat empty. Justice had been served, but there was no victory in it, only silence. After the trial, I returned to the house in Charleston. It looked exactly the same, but everything inside felt different. My father's chair was still there. The dining table he built still stood sturdy as ever. But the laughter, the conversations, the life that once filled the rooms, had vanished. At first, I didn't know where to begin again. Every morning I made myself a cup of black coffee, sat by the window, watched the sunrise, and listened to the long wail of the early train from the station. But instead of peace, all I felt was emptiness. David told me I should move to Atlanta, to live closer to his family. "You shouldn't stay alone forever, Dad," he said. Rachel called every day, afraid I would slip into loneliness. I knew they both worried, but I needed time. Some pains must be lived with, not avoided. Eventually, in the fall of 2016, I sold the house in Charleston. On the day I moved out, I packed the things my father had left behind: the table, the rocking chair, and the wooden box he built himself. I brought them with me to Atlanta, where I rented a small place on the outskirts of the city. I began learning how to live slowly, tending a small garden, fixing furniture, and sometimes helping David with odd jobs. Occasionally, Rachel brought the grandkids to visit. The house echoed with children's laughter again, a sound I hadn't realized I had missed so deeply. Time passed, and the wound began to heal. But one day in May 2018, when I opened the mailbox outside my home, I found an old envelope with no return address. It was marked, "From South Carolina Women's Correctional Facility." I knew immediately. It was from Marilyn. It took me a long while before I gathered the courage to open it. The letter was brief, but every line cut deep. "Harold, I do not expect forgiveness, because what I've done cannot be justified. I only want you to know that every day in this prison is a day I face the truth of who I am. I have lost everything: my family, my dignity, and even my own soul. I let my selfishness and my loneliness take the life of an innocent man. There are no words that can undo that. But if there is even the smallest quiet corner in your heart where I am not hated anymore, that alone is enough. Marilyn?" I folded the letter and sat in silence for hours. I didn't know whether her words were sincere or simply an attempt to find relief for herself. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger, only sorrow. I didn't write back. Some things don't need to be said, only released. In the summer of 2019, I received news that Richard Hale had died in prison, beaten by another inmate. The newspapers wrote only a short paragraph. I felt neither satisfaction nor grief, only the sense that a painful chapter had finally closed. In 2020, when the COVID pandemic hit, I lived alone in my small apartment. The world grew quiet, and I had far too much time to think. One evening, I opened my father's wooden box. Inside was his old notebook, the handwriting faint and shaky, but still clear. I read it, and for the first time, I didn't cry. I smiled. Dad, I understand now. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to stop letting the pain decide who we are. After that, I wrote a letter to Marilyn. Marilyn, I cannot say that I forgive you. Perhaps I am not noble enough for that. But I no longer hold hatred. You have paid your price, and I have learned how to live again. I hope you find peace wherever that may be, behind bars or in memory. Harold. I mailed the letter without expecting anything in return, but the moment it left my hands, I felt something lift, as if a door inside me had opened. 2 years later, in 2022, I received news that Marilyn had died in prison from diabetic complications. When Rachel asked how I felt, I simply said, "I'm at peace. I hope she is too." That evening, I cooked dinner for the whole family. Brisket, just like my father used to make, with cornbread, roasted potatoes, and a little bourbon. We sat together, laughed, and shared old stories. And in the laughter of my grandchildren, I heard something I thought I had lost forever: life. I realized that no matter how deep the pain goes, life continues, and the most precious thing we can do is choose how we move forward. In the spring of 2025, I decided to return to Charleston for the first time since I left. Nearly 9 years had passed, yet in my heart, every street, every corner, every familiar sound felt as though it had been waiting for me. I drove slowly beneath rows of oak trees, past white picket fences and porches draped in bougainvillea. This city was where I was born, where I loved, and where I lost everything. I stopped in front of my old house. A young family lived there now. The garden where I once grew coffee plants was lush and green. I didn't knock. I simply stood at a distance. The same beige curtains that Marilyn once chose still hung in the window. There was no anger left in me, only memory. Then I went to St. Luke's Cemetery, where my father rests. The wind off the Ashley River carried the scent of salt and wild grass. I placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the grave. I sat there for a long time, as if I could hear his voice drifting through the breeze. Harold, you did well. Don't let the darkness live forever in your heart. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and for the first time in many years, I felt true peace. That afternoon, I stopped by the old dock where my father once worked. Only a few small boats remained tied up, and the old woodworking shop had become a cozy cafe called Harbor Grounds. I walked in and ordered a black coffee. The young barista asked, "Have you been here long, sir?" I smiled. "All my life. My father used to build boats here." She said she'd heard the elders talk about old Eli Dunn, the man who once made the finest boats in Charleston. I answered quietly, "Yes, he was my father, a good man." When I left the cafe, I drove toward the sunset. The golden light poured across the water, and I realized every storm eventually passes. What remains are memories and the gentleness we choose to carry forward. Now, at 77, I hold no resentment. I understand now that forgiveness is not a gift for the one who hurt us. It is a gift we give ourselves. Forgiveness does not erase the past. It simply opens a future. And if someone were to ask whether I still believe in love, I would smile and say, yes, love does not die. It only changes its shape. Now it lives in the laughter of my grandchildren, in the warmth of morning coffee. There was a time when I lost everything: love, trust, even the will to live. But from that place, I learned how to begin again. And if you are hearing this story, remember, no matter how dark the night, morning will come. No matter how long the road, there is always a path forward for those who keep walking. Life is not about forgetting pain. It is about transforming it into wisdom, so every scar becomes proof that we once lived with our whole heart. I looked up at the Charleston sky, now turning violet with dusk. The wind carried the smell of salt, and a distant train called out across the water. I smiled, light, unburdened, whole. Dad, I have found peace.